This is Chapter 50 of Pride and Prejudice, or Chapter 8 of Volume 3. Mr. Bennet had very often wished, before this period of his life, that instead of spending his whole income, he had laid by an annual sum for the better provision of his children and of his wife, if she survived him. He now wished it more than ever. Had he done his duty in that respect, Lydia need not have been indebted to her uncle for whatever of honor or credit could now be purchased for her. The satisfaction of prevailing on one of the most worthless young men in Great Britain to be her husband might then have rested in its proper place. So Mr. Bennet regrets that he really spent all of his money that he earned every year. So instead of saving it and waiting for the need to spend a great amount of it, he just spent all of it throughout time. And now he feels bad because Mr. Gardiner has really paid for Wickham to marry Lydia, essentially bribed him, and Mr. Bennet feels indebted to Mr. Gardiner now. He was seriously concerned that a cause of so little advantage to anyone should be forwarded at the sole expense of his brother-in-law, and he was determined, if possible, to find out the extent of his existence, and to discharge the obligation as soon as he could. So now Mr. Bennet is ready and really wants to repay Mr. Gardiner as soon as he can. When first Mr. Bennet had married, economy was held to be perfectly useless, for, of course, they were to have a son. This son was to join in cutting off the entail as soon as he should be of age, and the widow and younger children would by that means be provided for. 5 daughters successively entered the world, but yet the son was to come, and Mrs. Bennet, for many years after Lydia's birth, had been certain that he would. This event had at last been despaired of, but it was then too late to be saving. Mrs. Bennet had no turn for economy, and her husband's love of independence had alone prevented their exceeding their income. So the Bennets always hoped that they would have a son that would cut off the entail so that their son would inherit Longbourn instead of Mr. Collins, but they never do have a son, and by the time they realize that they're not going to have a son, they haven't been saving and their habits are already set. So Mrs. Bennet does not like economy, so she doesn't like saving and being thrifty, and Mr. Bennet really likes being his love of independence prevented their exceeding their income, so Mr. Bennet doesn't like to be indebted to anyone, whether that's literally with money or more emotionally owe people anything, so only that keeps them from living beyond their means, so spending more than they earn, in other words. £5,000 was settled by marriage articles on Mrs. Bennet and the children, but in what proportions it should be divided amongst the latter depended on the will of the parents. This was one point, with regard to Lydia at least, which was now to be settled, and Mr. Bennet could have no hesitation in acceding to the proposal before him. In terms of grateful acknowledgment for the kindness of his brother, though expressed most concisely, he then delivered on paper his perfect approbation of all that was done, and his willingness to fulfill the engagements that had been made for him. He had never before supposed that, could Wickham be prevailed on to marry his daughter, it would be done with so little inconvenience to himself as by the present arrangement. He would scarcely be £10 a year the loser, by the 100 that was to be paid them. For what with her board and pocket allowance, and the continual presents and money which passed to her through her mother's hands, Lydia's expenses had been very little within that sum. So Mr. Bennet is thinking, now paying Wickham £100 a year doesn't seem so bad because Lydia just spent money however she wanted when she lived at home. That it would be done with such trifling exertion on his side, too, was another very welcome surprise, for his chief wish at present was to have as little trouble in the business as possible. When the first transports of rage which had produced his activity in seeking her were over, he naturally returned to all his former indolence. His letter was soon dispatched, for though dilatory in undertaking business, he was quick in its execution. He begged to know further particulars of what he was indebted to his brother, but was too angry with Lydia to send any message to her. So Mr. Bennet is also glad that he didn't have to do too much to make sure that Lydia was married to Wickham. And he does go and thank Mr. Gardiner, but he does not write a letter to Lydia because he is very angry with her still. The good news quickly spread through the house, and with proportionate speed through the neighborhood. It was borne in the latter with decent philosophy. To be sure, it would have been more for the advantage of conversation had Miss Lydia Bennet come upon the town, or, as the happiest alternative, been secluded from the world in some distant farmhouse. So come upon the town means to become a prostitute. So the neighbors are thinking that it would have made better conversation if Lydia had become a prostitute after this. Or been secluded from the world, so kept away from everybody in some distant farmhouse. So to everyone, this is not scandalous enough to be truly, truly juicy gossip. But there was much to be talked of in marrying her, and the good-natured wishes for her well-doing, which had proceeded before from all the spiteful old ladies in Meryton, lost but little of their spirit in this change of circumstances, because with such a husband her misery was considered certain. So the women in town don't really wish Lydia well. They're kind of nasty about the whole situation. And now they are pretty confirmed in their belief that she will not be happy because Wickham is a bad guy and will be a bad husband. It was a fortnight since Mrs. Bennet had been downstairs. So it was 2 weeks since Mrs. Bennet had been downstairs. But on this happy day, she again took her seat at the head of her table, and in spirits oppressively high. No sentiment of shame gave a damp to her triumph. The marriage of a daughter, which had been the first object of her wishes since Jane was 16, was now on the point of accomplishment, and her thoughts and her words ran wholly on those attendants of elegant nuptials, fine muslins, new carriages, and servants. She was busily searching through the neighborhood for a proper situation for her daughter, and without knowing or considering what their income might be, rejected many as deficient in size and importance. So again, Mrs. Bennet is just thrilled that Lydia is marrying Wickham. She's just talking about carriages and clothes and trying to find them a house in the neighborhood. And she says, oh, that house isn't good enough for them, not realizing that their money, their budget and income may not be able to even get them the houses that Mrs. Bennet thinks are beneath them. Hay Park might do, said she, if the Gouldings would quit it, or the great house at Stoke if the drawing-room were larger, but Ashworth is too far off. I cannot bear to have her 10 miles from me, and as for Purvis Lodge, the attics are dreadful. Her husband allowed her to talk on without interruption, while the servants remained. But when they had withdrawn, he said to her, Mrs. Bennet, before you take any or all of these houses for your son and daughter, let us come to a right understanding. Into one house in this neighborhood they shall never have admittance. I will not encourage the imprudence of either by receiving them at Longbourn. So Mr. Bennet doesn't interrupt his wife when the servants are there. Servants are often around in the house, and they may be kind of like seen and not heard. So they're there, but they're not always included in the family conversations. So Mr. Bennet knows that they may be listening and doesn't want to say anything in front of them. But when they leave, he tells Mrs. Bennet that Lydia and Wickham will never be allowed in Longbourn. Ouch. A long dispute followed this declaration, but Mr. Bennet was firm. It soon led to another, and Mrs. Bennet found, with amazement and horror, that her husband would not advance a guinea to buy clothes for his daughter. He protested that she should receive from him no mark of affection whatever on the occasion. Mrs. Bennet could hardly comprehend it, that his anger could be carried to such a point of inconceivable resentment as to refuse his daughter a privilege, without which her marriage would scarcely seem valid, exceeded all that she could believe possible. She was more alive to the disgrace, which her want of new clothes must reflect on her daughter's nuptials, than to any sense of shame at her eloping and living with Wickham a fortnight before they took place. So Mrs. Bennet is really just worried that they won't have proper clothes for the wedding and for after the wedding, and Mr. Bennet says that he's not going to pay for that either. And Mrs. Bennet is furious and thinks the wedding seems hardly valid, and she feels ashamed of that, but she doesn't feel ashamed with the fact that to Regency readers would have seemed much more scandalous. She doesn't seem ashamed that Lydia and Wickham ran away together and lived together for 2 weeks without being married. Elizabeth was now most heartily sorry that she had, from the distress of the moment, been led to make Mr. Darcy acquainted with their fears for her sister. For since her marriage would so shortly give the proper termination to the elopement, they might hope to conceal its unfavorable beginning from all those who were not immediately on the spot. So Elizabeth now feels bad that she had to tell Mr. Darcy what was going on with Lydia and Wickham, because now that it's been resolved, they may have been able to keep it a secret from anyone who they didn't have to tell, who wasn't necessary to inform. She had no fear of it spreading farther through his means. There are few people on whose secrecy she would have more confidently depended, but at the same time there was no one whose knowledge of a sister's frailty would have mortified her so much. not, however, from any fear of disadvantage from it individually to herself, for at any rate there seemed a gulf impassable between them. Had Lydia's marriage been concluded on the most honourable terms, it was not to be supposed that Mr. Darcy would connect himself with a family, where to every other objection would now be added an alliance and relationship of the nearest kind with the man whom he so justly scorned. So now Elizabeth thinks that, even though there's all of these obstacles between her and Mr. Darcy already, now Elizabeth thinks this is really impossible, because if Elizabeth and Darcy married and Lydia and Wickham were now married, that would mean that Wickham was Mr. Darcy's brother-in-law. So Elizabeth thinks that now there's no chance at all that Mr. Darcy would ever marry her, ever be with her, because that would mean that he would be close to Wickham. From such a connection she could not wonder that he should shrink. The wish of procuring her regard, which she had assured herself of his feeling in Derbyshire, could not in rational expectation survive such a blow as this. She was humbled, she was grieved, she repented, though she hardly knew of what. She became jealous of his esteem when she could no longer hope to be benefited by it. She wanted to hear of him when there seemed the least chance of gaining intelligence. She was convinced that she could have been happy with him when it was no longer likely they should meet. There's a lot of paradox going on in this paragraph. So at this point, Elizabeth is pretty certain that she loves Mr. Darcy, and now she realizes that she would have been happy with him now that it's impossible that they'll ever be together. I always think of one of these situations like if you have the choice between onion rings and French fries, and you don't know which one to order, and someone tells you, oh, order the onion rings, and then you realize, oh, I really want the French fries because someone has now told me that I can't have what I really want. So I think it's one of those sorts of scenarios. What a triumph for him, as she often thought, could he know that the proposals which she had proudly spurned only 4 months ago would now have been gladly and gratefully received. He was as generous, she doubted not, as the most generous of his sex. But while he was mortal, there must be a triumph. So Elizabeth thinks, oh, geez, wouldn't he feel happy like he had won something now to know that she would have said yes to all of his proposals at this point in the book. She began now to comprehend that he was exactly the man who, in disposition and talents, would most suit her. His understanding and temper, though unlike her own, would have answered all her wishes. It was an union that must have been to the advantage of both. By her ease and liveliness, his mind might have been softened, his manners improved, and from his judgment, information, and knowledge of the world, she must have received benefit of greater importance. So now Elizabeth thinks that they really would have been a good match together. They would have sort of balanced each other out. So she's lively, full of life, and kind of easygoing, and Mr. Darcy, that would have like softened Mr. Darcy a little bit, and improved his manners, so made him not so obnoxious. And because he has good judgment, he knows a lot, and he's knowledgeable of the world, Elizabeth would have been better informed. So she sees in that way their personalities would have meshed. But no such happy marriage could now teach the admiring multitude what connubial felicity really was. An union of a different tendency and precluding the possibility of the other was soon to be formed in their family. How Wickham and Lydia were to be supported in tolerable independence she could not imagine. But how little of permanent happiness could belong to a couple who were only brought together because their passions were stronger than their virtue, she could easily conjecture. So Elizabeth is now thinking about Wickham and Lydia. She can't think of how they're going to be able to support themselves, but she can think of how they will not be happy together, but how little of permanent happiness could belong to a couple who are only brought together because their passions were stronger than their virtue. So Elizabeth thinks that they can't have happiness that will last forever because they were only brought together by their whims of the moment, their desires, stronger than their virtues, so their morals and their ideas of what's right and what's wrong. So their passions are stronger than their morals. She could easily conjecture. So she can pretty quickly figure out that this is not going to be a marriage with lasting happiness. Mr. Gardiner soon wrote again to his brother. To Mr. Bennet's acknowledgments he briefly replied, with assurances of his eagerness to promote the welfare of any of his family, and concluded with entreaties that the subject might never be mentioned to him again. The principal purport of his letter was to inform them that Mr. Wickham had resolved on quitting the militia. It was greatly my wish that he should do so, he added, as soon as his marriage was fixed on, and I think you will agree with me in considering a removal from that corps as highly advisable, both on his account and my niece's. It is Mr. Wickham's intention to go into the regulars, and among his former friends, there are still some who are able and willing to assist him in the army. He has the promise of an ensignacy in General Blank's regiment, now quartered in the north. It is an advantage to have it so far from this part of the kingdom. He promises fairly, and I hope among different people, where they may each have a character to preserve, they will both be more prudent. I have written to Colonel Forster to inform him of our present arrangements, and to request that he will satisfy the various creditors of Mr. Wickham in and near Brighton with assurances of speedy payment, for which I have pledged myself. And will you give yourself the trouble of carrying similar assurances to his creditors in Meryton, of whom I shall subjoin a list, according to his information. He has given in all his debts. I hope at least he has not deceived us. Haggerston has our directions, and all will be completed in a week. Then they will join his regiment, unless they are first invited to Longbourn, and I understand from Mrs. Gardiner that my niece is very desirous of seeing you all before she leaves the south. She is well, and begs to be dutifully remembered to you and her mother, yours and company, E. Gardiner. So Mr. Gardiner tells Mr. Bennet really just to forget the kindnesses that he's done, don't mention the circumstances again. He says that Wickham is going to leave the militia and instead join the regulars, which are a little bit more prestigious and a little bit more respected even than the militia. And they're also going to go to a different location. Mr. Gardiner says that he's going to pay all of Wickham's, all the people that Wickham owes money to where he was staying in Brighton. And he asked Mr. Bennet if he'll also let the people in Meryton who still need money from Wickham, if he'll let them know that the money will be repaid. Mr. Bennet and his daughter saw all the advantage of Wickham's removal from the Blankshire as clearly as Mr. Gardiner could do, but Mrs. Bennet was not so well pleased with it. Lydia's being settled in the north, just when she had expected most pleasure and pride in her company, for she had by no means given up her plan of their residing in Hertfordshire, was a severe disappointment. And besides, it was such a pity that Lydia should be taken from a regiment where she was acquainted with everybody, and had so many favourites. She's so fond of Mrs. Forster, said she, it will be quite shocking to send her away, and there are several of the young men, too, that she likes very much. The officers may not be so pleasant in General Blank's regiment. His daughter's request, for such it might be considered, of being admitted into her family again before she set off for the north, received at first an absolute negative. But Jane and Elizabeth, who agreed in wishing, for the sake of their sister's feelings and consequence, that she should be noticed on her marriage by her parents, urged him so earnestly, yet so rationally and so mildly, to receive her and her husband at Longbourn as soon as they were married, that he was prevailed on to think as they thought, and act as they wished. And their mother had the satisfaction of knowing that she should be able to show her married daughter in the neighbourhood before she was banished to the north. When Mr. Bennet wrote again to his brother, therefore, he sent his permission for them to come, and it was settled that, as soon as the ceremony was over, they should proceed to Longbourn. Elizabeth was surprised, however, that Wickham should consent to such a scheme, and, had she consulted only her own inclination, any meeting with him would have been the last object of her wishes. So, Mrs. Gardiner tells Mr. Gardiner that Lydia would like to go visit her family at Longbourn. At first, Mr. Bennet says absolutely not, but then Jane and Elizabeth very persuasively, but also very mildly and gently, convince Mr. Bennet that Lydia should come to visit all of them, just to save Lydia's feelings and to make her feel acknowledged. And although Elizabeth is not happy about seeing Wickham again, she does want Lydia to feel okay with the situation. And that's chapter 50.